Anguish and anger swept the close-knit community of Union, South Carolina. Susan Smith, after all, had grown up here. When she reported her children kidnapped, many felt as if their own children were missing.
Stuff like that don't happen here. It's just...
Did you believe her?
Yeah. Everybody believed her.
I did.
Well,
My body got something wasn't right from the beginning.
Hoax don't walk into a room planning to confess to a crime.
Until yesterday afternoon, authorities had held out hope that little Michael and Alex Smith would be found alive. Then, the awful discovery. Their mother, Susan Smith, had apparently concocted an elaborate hoax to cover up their deaths. A grim-faced Sheriff Howard Wells, who had led an around-the-clock search, made the announcement.
Susan Smith has been arrested and will be charged with 2 counts of murder in connection with the deaths of her children.
They walk in there planning to confess to something small. It was a push, an accident, a bad decision, something they can live with. And in an interrogation room, that crack is where the case starts to break open.
Was getting Susan Smith to tell the truth after so many days of denial, how difficult was that?
It was difficult, particularly she had been interviewed on several occasions before and was actually given a polygraph before. So when I went up there, started the interview, I knew in my own mind that I couldn't be hard on her because the last time somebody got difficult with her and hollered at her, she walked out of the interview.
So most people think that a confession happens when a suspect breaks down crying and says, "I did it." That almost never happens.
I knew that's what I was facing. And I also knew, John, that if we didn't get something out of Susan Smith, the case may not have been solved because only she and the man upstairs knew what she did. Nobody else saw it, nobody else proved it.
Real confessions are usually quieter than that. And the suspect agrees to a smaller version of the crime, a version that sounds less evil, a version that lets them keep some or part of their identity. They don't say I'm a murderer. They say I snapped. They said it got out of hand. They say I didn't mean for it to happen.
So I knew it was difficult, so I took it very slowly. 5 days of interviews to get to the end of it.
Law enforcement officials had their doubts too.
I think early on, law enforcement just felt that there were some inconsistencies.
But the moment they accept the smaller version, we have what we need. Not the full truth, not yet at least, but at least the first crack in the wall.
Well, actually I have to give credit to a maintenance man in the area who knew that the traffic light where she says the kidnap occurred doesn't turn red if there's no cars at the intersection. It's always green. And she was saying that she was stopped there and that's where she was kidnapped. And so when I confronted her with that, I finally got the truth out of her.
And once they cross that line from denial to involvement, everything changes for us.
And what I did, I gave her another avenue to go in. I gave her the avenue of, could this have happened somewhere else because the light would have turned green and you wouldn't have been stopped. And finally, after a while, she went down that road and said, yes, it happened over here 10 miles away at a little town. And so then I knew that probably had her foot in the door and that she probably was going to tell us later on what happened. That turned the point. In fact, I told her to go home, and I said, go home and write a statement as to everything that happened when you went to the new place. She came in the next day with a statement in detail about it. And of course, the sheriff and I then decided, well, we'd tell her we had a surveillance of the place. And when we did that, it kind of went downhill for her, and she finally confessed.
This is the Hill of Justice.
I'm coming to you on location here in California, and we're breaking down one of the most powerful interrogation tools used in major crime investigations. It's called minimization. And once you learn how to spot it, you'll never watch interrogations quite the same way again. Now, I'm Jerome Hill, former officer and state investigator. My brother, Victor, will join me next week. I'm going to break down some major cases through the lens of an investigator. Hill Nation already does this, but if you're new here, subscribe, follow the show, and hit the notification bell. We'll be uploading weekly, and these breakdowns are designed to help you see what most people don't see. So people are asking, what is minimization? Minimization is when an investigator gives the suspect a morally acceptable explanation for what happened. It's not legally acceptable, but it's morally acceptable, and I'll tell you why and how it matters. The detective is not saying this makes you innocent. And that's not what we're doing at all. What we're saying is this makes you understandable. And what we're trying to achieve there as we're sitting there is we're trying to achieve something that they can go ahead and live with. We know that the suspect is sitting there, basically fighting two battles at the same time. The first battle they're trying to fight is they don't want to go to prison. And the second battle, they don't want to see themselves as a monster, at least not in their own mind and not in front of their family, and particularly not on video, and probably not in courtroom either. So minimization solves that second battle. We offer a version of events where the suspect is still human, didn't plan this, you panicked, you were scared, you lost control, you reacted. That story may sound softer, but legally it could still be devastating. Because once the suspect admits involvement, the interrogation has shifted. The denial wall is no longer solid. The three pillars of minimization is the moral off-ramp. This gives them a reason that is not monstrous to them. The second one is shared blame. The situation, it was because of the situation, it was because of the argument, it was because of the moment. We may even have a way of saying that maybe the victim instigated it in some type of way. The third one is a smaller scale, an accident. It wasn't a murder. And these are the reasons why it works. A guilty suspect often does not want to confess to the full truth, but they may confess to a version that projects their self-image. That is the opening we look for. And what we see is, and what we might say is, you're not a bad person. This wasn't planned. You were under pressure. You just need to explain how it got out of control. That sounds compassionate, but it's also strategic. We're lowering the emotional cost of the admission. And we're not asking the suspect to jump from, I know nothing, to, I committed the murder. We're building a bridge. And once that suspect walks across that bridge, we can start asking details. And that's where we want to get to. Where were you standing? What happened next? What did you do with the body? Where is the weapon? Who else knows? Where's the drugs? They think they're accepting a smaller story. But in fact, what we're doing is using that smaller story to unlock the larger truth. And to make it a little bit more clear to you, I don't know if you remember the case with Chris Watts. So let's go ahead and dive into that. His pregnant wife at the time, Shannon Watts, and his two daughters, Bella and Celeste, were missing. Watts had just failed a polygraph, and that is a major psychological moment for us and opens up so much more. What we start doing at that time, once a suspect believes, we already know that they're lying. We know that the pressure changes at that point. He was offered a version of the story, which we call a smaller version, minimization. And we are suggesting to him that someone other than him may have done something. And what we're looking for is a reaction from Chris. Let me tell you something. They always react. That was the moral off-ramp that we used. We're not asking them to say, I murdered my family. We would like that. But what we're trying to do is offer them a frame where they could see themselves as a grieving father, at least in this case. We want to see how he reacted, and particularly how he would react after something terrible happens. Even though the frame was false that we gave him, but in that moment, it gave him a way out of total denial. We watch his body language. We watch the shoulders. We watch him breathing. We see the shift in his energy. These are all the things that we're looking for. And it's not just the words. We look for the moment the suspect accepts this type of frame. And once Watts accepted that smaller version, the wall cracks. And that's all we really need, is just for it to crack. And we can go ahead and go into other avenues. Do they try to tell us the full truth? No. We still have to do our job and put that together. But to be clear, we understand that that wasn't the complete truth at the time. And he was able to eventually admit that he killed Shannon and the children. But that's the first doorway that was opened by minimization. He did not begin with the full horror of what happened, but he began with a version that made him look less monstrous. And that is a powerful technique. The suspect thinks they're controlling the damage, but we are actually controlling the direction. Watts is now serving life in prison without parole. Also know this, sometimes the first confession isn't the truth. And we see this time and time again. Sometimes it's the suspect's last attempt to manage how the truth will be seen is what they're trying to do. So, and this is exactly why we bring this type of show to you so we can break down these cases, because the headlines tell you what happened, but interrogations show you how the truth starts moving in that space. If you value this kind of breakdown, subscribe, follow the show, and hit the notification bell. What we're trying to do also is take a look at the next case, and that's with Susan Smith. Many of you may remember Susan Smith. For 9 days, she claimed a black man had carjacked her and driven away with her 2 young sons. That false claim sent the public looking in the wrong direction, if you remember. And we needed to say this, and we really need to say this plainly, right? That accusation did not happen in a vacuum. It played into preposterous racial fears at the time, and it created suspicion around an innocent group of people. And it showed how quickly a false story could become a public manhunt. That is one of the most overlooked harms in that particular case. And it wasn't just about the murder. It wasn't just about the lie, but the damage caused by who she chose to blame on top of that. Of course, the victims were first and foremost on our minds. But when investigators sat with Susan Smith, they had to get past the story that she had been repeating over and over and over again. And the off-ramp had to fit her particularly. And we have to tailor make it to fit the person's personality, their life, their ideology, etc. So that is critically important. Minimization is not about one size fits all. We do not offer the story that makes sense to us. We offer the story that makes sense to the suspect. And that's what we're trying to achieve. For Smith, the reported approach was emotional and religious. We leaned into that particular guilt. And it leaned into the forgiveness portion of it. And the investigators did a great job. And that idea was the antithesis of the silence that she was going through, that they were able to go ahead and make sure that that was a sin in itself. So if I was reconstructing that version of the approach like they did, and I'm not quite sure if they did this, but if I was to go ahead and reconstruct it, I would be like, Susan, I know you love those boys. I know whatever happened, you were hurting and you weren't your particular self, but you have to tell the truth now, make this right. That is minimization in a different costume. And with Watts, the off-ramp was he reacted because we framed someone else other than him that hurt his family. With Smith, what they did was they used the off-ramp, which was closer to you're not beyond forgiveness, but you have to stop lying. Different suspects, different values, same strategy. We get them to move from denial to admission. And so what I want to talk about now is how do we spot minimization? And this is how you can do it, okay? When you watch an interrogation, there's probably about 3 major signs that you'll look for. The first sign that you're going to see is the pronoun shift, and it'll go something like this. And we'll stop saying the word you and start saying we. Okay, so follow me on this. We need you to understand what happened. We can work through this. We need your side of things. See, that sounds a bit more supportive, but it also pulls the suspect into thinking that there's a cooperation there. And what we're doing is we're creating an effect that we are a team inside that room. We're nowhere near being a team in that side of the room, but it's one of the things that we use. The second part would be the alternative questions that we ask. This one is probably one of the strongest tools we use. We offer two sets of the crime to them. One is going to sound cold, calculating, and evil. The other is going to sound a bit more emotional and understandable. So let me go ahead and try to give an example. Did you plan this for weeks? Or did it just happen in the moment and you couldn't control yourself? The question sounds like it gives the suspect a choice, but both of those choices actually assume involvement. There is no third option inside that question. There is no, I didn't do it, or things of that nature. That is why that alternative question is so powerful. It moves the suspect away from denial and forces them to choose the less damaging version. The other part is, and this is the third part, is the body language shift. We've asked them a series of questions and we're studying their body language. And certainly some gotcha moments that we have set up in that interrogation and those questions, we know that we can tell and ask certain questions that are going to make them feel comfortable over a set of time. And then the most uncomfortable questions, we're going to look at that body shift. And even before the suspect says the word, the body often moves first. The shoulders drop, the eyes close, the breathing starts becoming a little bit more labored or different. The suspect starts nodding. They stop fighting the entire accusation and they start negotiating the version of the accusation they can live with, basically. And this is the moment we're watching for. And once the suspect buys into that version of events, the confession starts to unfold on its own. Now, we're not going to pull the whole story out of them, but it gets the ball started. And we're letting the suspect at that point in time fill in the blanks. And then, of course, we'll match it up with other evidences and other corroborations from witnesses or even from their version a little bit later or before. Why does this matter? Now, this is where I have to be honest with you. This is part of the Reed technique, and certainly minimization works, and it's been used in serious criminal investigations, but it also has some controversy that I need to talk to you about, and it could be devastatingly misused. That same technique I talked about to get a guilty person to confess can also be used to pressure an innocent person into accepting a story that's not true. It's happened time and time again, especially if that person is young, they're scared, they're exhausted, they're low functioning, maybe have some mental vulnerability, or they're convinced the police already have evidence they can't be. That does not mean we have the correct evidence for the suspect, but that could be in their mind. Now, if you offer a terrified teenager a smaller version of a story, and it sounds like that's their only way out, the teenager may agree just to survive the moment and agree to it. And that's how false confessions start happening. Case in point, if you remember the Central Park 5 case. That was a masterclass on what not to do in minimization. That was horrific. And everyone in that situation had, particularly the detectives in that situation, should have no longer been on the force. That was horrific on that end of it. It's also basically recognized as a textbook case of how to coerce and get a false confession. Those cases are warnings that should not happen. They show us that the goal of the interrogation cannot simply be getting those words out of somebody's mouth. That's not the goal. The goal has to be getting reliable truth. They don't do that. And that means that we as investigators must be careful about that, because an investigation has to be solid and credible. This is how powerful a confession could be. A jury hears a confession. They hear it differently than any other evidence that is there. I'm letting you know. And even when there are problems with it, even when the details do not match, that is why every confession must be tested against evidence. The suspect can later recant this, but the juries will pay attention to that more closely. What we need to do as investigators is take a look at those facts and see if those facts, are something that the offender would know, or there are physical facts that match that particular statement. We have to test each and every one of them. I don't think that a lot of that is being done. They're solid, but this goes back to supervisors really taking a look at what has been done. Did the detective feed them the story? Because you can go ahead and lead them onto those type of facts too. So that's the difference between a confession that solves a case and a confession that contaminates one. And the bigger takeaway out of all this is that real interrogations is not always loud. It's not always aggressive. It's not always the Hollywood version with yelling, threats, or a table being slammed at. Sometimes it's calm. Sometimes it's soft, and sometimes it's like sympathy. We sit across from a suspect and offer them a story that they almost always want to believe. You're not evil. You just panicked. You were pushed too far. And you made one bad decision. And the suspect thinks that story protects them. But in reality, it may be the first step to their own conviction. That's why minimization is so powerful. It does not always pull out the whole truth immediately, and I need to stress that. But it can move a suspect from denial to involvement. And once they admit involvement, the investigation changes. So the next time you watch an interrogation, listen closely. Do not listen out for the confession. Listen for the smaller version. Listen for the moral off-ramp. Listen for the alternative question. Listen for the moment the suspect stops saying, "I was not there," and they start saying, "It did not happen like that." That is the shift that you're looking for. That is where the case starts to turn. Chris Watts did not walk into that room ready to tell the full truth. He accepted the smaller story first, and that smaller story opened the door. Now, I want to hear from you out in Hill Nation. Do you believe minimization is smart interrogation, or do you believe it creates too much risk for false confessions? Drop your answers in the comments below. Make sure you subscribe, follow The Hill of Justice, and hit the notification bell. We're uploading weekly, and the next breakdown may change how you look at criminal investigations. Until then.
This is the Hill of Justice.